All right, let's dive into one of the most misunderstood topics in all of Christian history, indulgences. For a lot of people, this word brings up some pretty strong images, but today we're going to cut through the noise and look at what the doctrine actually says.
This right here is the question that started it all. It's the big one. Can you really just purchase a spiritual get-out-of-jail-free card? Is that what this is all about? Well, to answer that, we have to look at the official definition, and you might be surprised.
Okay, right off the bat, that probably sounds very different from what you were expecting. Notice those two key phrases, temporal punishment and guilt has already been forgiven. See, an indulgence doesn't forgive the sin itself. It's about what happens after you've been forgiven. That's the absolute core of this. So to really get it, we need to understand a foundational principle. So according to the theology here, every sin has two different consequences. Think of it like this. If you punch a hole in your friend's wall, you can apologize and your friend can forgive you completely. That's great. But there's still a hole in the wall that needs to be repaired. That's kind of what this is about. On one side, you've got the eternal punishment. This is the biggie, the guilt that fractures your relationship with God. That gets wiped away by forgiveness, like in confession. But then there's the other side, the temporal punishment. This is the hole in the wall, the unhealthy attachments and consequences from the sin that still need to be cleaned up and purified, either in this life or the next. Now, I know this might sound a little abstract, but stick with me, because there's a fantastic, really clear example of this in the Bible. We're talking about the story of King David and his affair with Bathsheba. So, David is confronted, he repents, and what happens? God forgives him. The text is crystal clear. The eternal consequence is gone. God says, "You shall not die." The relationship is restored. And here's the heartbreaking part that shows the other side of the coin. Even though David was totally forgiven, there was still a painful, real-world consequence. The hole in the wall still needed to be dealt with. This is a perfect illustration of what's meant by temporal punishment. Okay, so if this temporal punishment is a real thing, the next question is obvious. How do you deal with it? And who has the authority to do so? Well, that brings us to the second pillar of this whole doctrine. This verse from the Gospel of Matthew is everything here. In Catholic teaching, this power of the keys given to St. Peter is understood to be the authority to manage the spiritual life of the church, and that includes dealing with these kinds of penalties. So how does the church do it? The concept is that it draws from what's called the treasury of merits. Now, this isn't a vault of gold coins. Think of it as a spiritual treasury filled with the infinite goodness of Jesus' sacrifice, plus all the prayers and good works of the saints. The church, using its keys, can then apply that grace to help believers with their temporal punishment. All right, now that we have those two big ideas, the double consequence and the church's authority, we can finally go back and tackle all those myths head on. So let's do a little rapid-fire myth busting. Myth: you can buy an indulgence. Fact: absolutely not. That was an abuse, and the church itself banned any financial transactions for them way back in 1567. Myth: it forgives your sin. Fact: nope, it's a prerequisite that the sin is already forgiven. Myth: it's a get-out-of-hell-free card. Fact: no way. It only deals with temporal punishment, not the eternal kind, and it can never, ever apply to sins you haven't committed yet. So look, if you only remember one thing from all of this, make it this right here. An indulgence has nothing to do with forgiving the guilt of sin. That's the myth. The reality is that it's all about dealing with a leftover temporal punishment from sins that have already been forgiven. Of course, I know what you're thinking. But wait, what about Martin Luther? What about the Protestant Reformation? You can't talk about indulgences without talking about that historical firestorm. So what really happened? The big historical problem wasn't that the official teaching was pay cash for forgiveness. The issue was that one of the good works you could do to receive an indulgence was almsgiving, giving a charitable donation. And you can see how that got twisted. It was a practice that was seriously abused by some, and it started to look a whole lot like a simple transaction. It was a huge scandal, and the church itself eventually reformed the practice because of it. Which brings us to today. The practice of indulgences didn't just disappear after the Reformation. It was clarified, and it continues. So what's it all about in the 21st century? Well, these days there are two types. You have a partial indulgence, which, you guessed it, removes part of your temporal punishment. And then you have a plenary indulgence, which removes all of it. But getting a plenary indulgence, well, it's actually incredibly difficult. And I mean really difficult. It's not a casual thing at all. There's a whole checklist of specific and pretty tough spiritual conditions that you have to meet. You have to go to confession, receive communion, pray for the Pope's intentions, and do the specific act itself. But here's the real kicker. That last condition. You must be completely detached from all sin, not just the big stuff, but even the minor venial sins. That is a profoundly high spiritual bar. If you're not perfectly detached, the indulgence is only partial. And what are these indulgence acts today? Well, they have nothing to do with money. We're talking about things like praying the rosary in a church, reading scripture for at least half an hour, or even something as simple as devoutly making the sign of the cross. The whole focus is on spiritual growth. So this brings us full circle. The doctrine of indulgences, when you get right down to it, isn't some kind of shortcut or loophole. It's meant to be a spiritual practice that encourages prayer and devotion to help heal the lingering damage of sin, long after that sin has been forgiven. So when you strip away all the myths and the historical baggage, you're left with this theological idea. So the question becomes, is it a meaningful tool that can help people grow in holiness today? Or is it simply a relic of a bygone era? That's something to think about. Thanks for joining us.